All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining, and good morning. Thanks for joining the WRI's Air Quality Tech Talk series. The Air Quality Tech Talk webinar series covers key topics around technology and science and air quality, with an emphasis on learning from the experiences and projects happening around WRI's global offices, as well as external partners. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Baldauf from the US EPA, who will present about the EPA's programs and resources on the management and mitigation of transport-related emissions. Dr. Baldauf has over 20 years of experience conducting research on transportation and industrial source emissions, air quality impacts, and adverse health environmental impacts. His research has contributed to the development of national emission standards and best practices to mitigate air pollution impacts at the local, regional, and global scale. He has also championed urban development initiatives, including the use of built and green infrastructure to reduce air pollution at schools and within communities. Dr. Baldauf has a joint affiliation with the US EPA's Office of Research and Development and the Office of Transportation and Air Quality, where he leads international cross-disciplinary research teams focusing on air quality management, measurements, air dispersion models, and sustainable transportation and urban development issues. He co-manages the US EPA's Mobile Source Emissions Research Laboratory and led the cross-agency Sustainable Transportation Initiative. Additionally, Dr. Baldauf advises multiple international organizations on air pollution measurement and control strategies, including the United Nations and WHO. He maintains adjunct professor appointments at the School of Engineering at North Carolina State University and Texas A&M, where he has published over 100 peer-reviewed journals and several book chapters on these topics. So with that, I would like for everyone to take a quick moment and try to mute yourselves on Zoom. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Baldauf.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I appreciate the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well.
Okay, great. And I do have a warning for you. Unfortunately, I did get dropped from the meeting, so I am calling in again. So I'll kind of be running a little bit blind, so I'll just make sure that I'm clear on which slide I'm talking from, okay?
Definitely.
Okay, great. So yeah, just for the cover slide, and again, I want to thank you for the invitation to present here and share some of the research and programs that we're doing at the EPA around transportation, both emissions and control. Since transportation sources are major contributors to air pollution and are present really almost everywhere in the world, there's great interest in reducing their impacts on air quality and public health. So for my presentation, I'll again kind of describe the work we're doing, what kind of resources are available, again, in this context of measurement and mitigation of the transport sector. So we can go to the next slide actually listed as slide 1. This is just an overview of my presentation. So I'll just give a
I apologize, folks. I believe we've lost Dr. Baldauf.
Hi, everyone. This is Beatriz Cárdenas from WRI Mexico. And I just will, we lost Dr. Baldauf. He must be connecting soon. He was having problems with his phone and computer. I would just like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who is joining us today. So we have Richard again, right?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, I'm
Great.
sorry. Yeah.
No problem.
Been having some internet issues out here. So hopefully I'll stay.
Thank you,
Okay,
Richard.
I'm not
Go
sure.
ahead.
Did I even get to the next slide?
Yeah,
My
the
overview?
presentation overview. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So again, I'll just really talk about some of the programs and resources that we're doing in this area, as well as some current projects underway. So we can go to slide 2, the health effects from air pollution. And again, I'll go through this very quickly because I know a lot of this information is on the WRI dashboard as well. But it's always important to have this as a reminder of how important the air pollution is to public health. So again, as I think most are aware, WHO in 2016 estimated over 7 million deaths from air pollution exposure worldwide, about half of those from outdoor air exposure, and those ranging from strokes, heart attacks, lung cancer. Again, the estimate of 9 out of 10 people worldwide breathing unhealthy air. And again, traffic is one of the highest, if not often the highest contributor to outdoor air pollution as well. So one of the reasons for this big concern. And so now that places air pollution as the 4th highest cause of death worldwide, just behind smoking, high blood pressure, and diet. So, and again, a lot of these deaths actually are occurring in kind of the low, middle income countries. And so again, that makes sharing information, capacity building even that much more important. So we can go to the next slide. And essentially there's 3 primary sources of air pollution from transportation sources, specifically traffic. So we have combustion of fuel, so the exhaust emissions, and we do tend to separate those by exhaust from cars and exhaust from trucks. In a lot of countries, there's different fuels that light-duty cars and passenger vehicles tend to use gasoline, heavy-duty trucks tend to use diesel. And there are differences in those emissions as well. But then we also have brake and tire wear. We also have the dust that can be re-entrained from transportation sources. And again, so these all can contribute to particulate matter in the air, but then also can contribute to quite a few gases that can be emitted, especially from exhaust emissions, things like nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, toxics like benzene, toluene, etc. So we can go to the next slide. And transport is really the most, if not the dominant source for local, regional, and global, even air pollution. Again, I'm going to tend to focus a lot on the local air pollution issue, but keeping in mind that a lot of this is relevant to regional and global air pollution. But yeah, many urban areas worldwide, 70% or more of particulate matter can be attributed to traffic and other transportation sources. Often, actually, we know worldwide more than half of like nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide comes from transportation. And again, we know, especially in exhaust, but also even fire and re-entrained dust, that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of other contaminants and compounds that can be emitted, many of which are known toxics or adverse, cause adverse health effects. So we can go to the next slide, number 5. And again, transport can actually affect disproportionately low and middle income countries in particular. There's many reasons for this. I just kind of listed 3 of the major ones. They often have older, poorly maintained vehicles. Often they're secondary vehicles shipped from wealthier nations as well. And so their operation, their maintenance of their after treatment, their air pollution control devices can be questionable and sometimes they're removed. We also know public transit can often be limited or not available at all. There's often a lack of like walking, biking, and other kind of alternative transport options. And then, and again, in many countries, there's limited or even no regulations on air pollution. So whether it be emission control standards, certification requirements, things like that. Again, this all sometimes puts a disproportionate burden on lower and middle income countries. So we can go to the next slide. And again, because transportation, traffic in particular, are so ubiquitous and so many people worldwide are exposed to these emissions daily, there's actually been quite a few hundreds of health studies that have really focused on this population that is so prevalent, both living, working, and going to school near large transportation facilities. And these studies are fairly consistent, showing this higher risk for these populations spending time near these impacts. Things like asthma, cardiovascular effects, birth developmental effects, again, premature mortality, cancer, including childhood leukemia, been shown to be elevated, and even things like cognitive effects. Autism has even shown association with spending a lot of time near these roads. You know, I have on this slide just a cover for a report done by the Health Effects Institute, which was a large meta-analysis that really kind of first showed the consistency in these findings and these concerns, adverse health effects. So we can go to the next. So been a few studies that have shown that pollution can be elevated near these large transportation sources, especially within the first 200 meters. So on this slide, I just have another meta-analysis. It was done on about 50 studies worldwide measuring air pollution changes with distance from large roadways. And we can see for in the far left, pollutants, they can be as much as an order of magnitude higher within that first 100 to 200 meters the roadway compared with further distances away. So again, exposures can be much higher and they can be much different near the road. So this is one of these causes for the concern for all this elevated health risk for these populations near the road. And so we can go to the next slide. And even though we're really talking about small distance, there's actually quite a large portion of the population that, again, does either lives, works, or goes to school in this short distance because it is such a center for economic activity and development in our urban areas. And so me working for a U.S. organization, you know, I do have some statistics for the U.S. that we estimate over 50 million people live within 100 meters of a large transportation facility. Most of that is our large highways here in the U.S., but that does include airports and ports, rail yards, and again, all of these are sources of, you know, concern and interest as far as elevated exposures. We also estimate over 4 million children attend classes within 150 meters of, just in this case, a major highway. And I have a couple of pictures just kind of showing examples, but they estimate that about 1 in 11 schools in the United States are located within this distance of a major highway, and actually 1 in 5 new schools, which makes it even more of a concern. And then we are finding that these numbers are often even higher in some of the low and middle income countries as well, where even more development, more population is located near these major transportation facilities. So we can go to the next slide. And when we talk about mitigation opportunities, we really kind of target, or at least put into categories, into these 3 areas. And that's how I'll present mine today. And so we look at the emissions and how we can measure and control emissions, how we can do that also for just air pollution concentrations once the pollutants have been emitted, and then actually how people are breathing these pollutants in or their exposures. So again, we can go to the next slide. And again, we're just to highlight that we're going to start with emissions. And so then we can go to the next slide, slide 11. So we have a number of programs to measure emissions from motor vehicles and other transportation sources. Again, I should just point out now, like, you know, we also can do a lot of these techniques aren't just relevant for like motor vehicles on the road, but we can do this for trains, ships, to some extent planes, although planes are much more difficult. But again, these programs and these techniques are applicable to these other kinds of sources as well. But I'll tend for this because, again, the traffic in these motor vehicles are the most ubiquitous, so I'll really focus on that area, but happy to answer any questions on these other sources. So as far as measurement programs and the importance of these programs, they really do answer quite a few questions that are very relevant. How bad is the problem of air pollution and emissions from the transportation sources, especially, again, understanding the transport sector compared with other air pollutant emission sources, even within the transport sector, which types and sources contribute the most to poor air quality. Then also, are any control strategies that have been implemented, are they effective, or do we need to make adjustments in the future? So again, these all lead to why measurement programs are important. So we can go to slide 12, and this is just a real brief overview of very typical measurement programs that can be seen really across the world. And the measurement techniques can range from remote sensing, where they can be things like opacity measurements, just to see how much smoke essentially is being emitted by a vehicle, to more refined, doing different types of gases like NO2, carbon monoxide, etc. And even as techniques can really range from being very screening level like opacity measurements to very refined techniques. But essentially this is where we have either a light or a laser beam across an area, and vehicles either drive or idle within that beam to estimate what the emissions are. Then going more complex, about 20 years ago, actually, at the EPA, we developed these onboard measurement systems. We call them PEMS, portable emission measurement systems. And they are actually on the vehicle itself while you drive, you can actually measure emissions. And these have gotten more famous recently because this is what was used for the Volkswagen investigation. So again, this popularity has really grown, especially in the last few years, and the use has really expanded. And then kind of we call the gold standard for emissions measurements are using like chassis and engine dynamometers, where we actually can simulate driving conditions, really control well how things are being driven, the fuels, the vehicles themselves, to really understand well, what the emission rates are. And this is usually most countries, their certification standards are based off of dynamometer measurements and testing. And as I indicate to the right, that in general, the cost, complexity, but also accuracy does increase as you go down with these different kinds of measurements. So often for us, when we're working with other countries and they're interested in developing these measurement programs, we usually really suggest and try to help them walk through developing these in stages, generally from least to most complex. But again, keeping in mind that it also means, least to most accurate as well. So we do try to keep that in mind and help that with the understanding of the data that's being generated. So we can go to slide 13. And again, just some example programs for air pollution control that can be implemented. Usually we don't implement just one of these, but do combinations of these as well. But again, the most typical are the emission standards. So what new vehicles, the emission rates that they need to certify to or not exceed. But also a number of countries are using this, especially some countries we're working with in Latin America are also doing emission standards for imported vehicles as well. Not just limiting like the age of the vehicle or mileage of the vehicle, but actually having emission standards as well. Another area is fuel quality. The most famous was reducing lead in gasoline. Now one of the big compounds that we're trying to reduce is sulfur in both gasoline and diesel fuel, but there are also other things like benzene and other compounds that we also try to reduce in the fuel to also reduce the emissions of those compounds. Fleet modernization is really related to the emission standards, but it does take a while for the fleet to transition, and so trying to get the most modern vehicles, the lowest emitting vehicles on the road, but this even includes like electrification, trying to get zero emissions on the road as well. And then there's ways to reduce activity, either improving public transit, improving walking, biking options, and those types of things to, again, just reduce the number of vehicles on the road. And so we try to use these lessons learned when working with other countries, trying to implement these programs. But of course, it's really important that they're appropriate for the local conditions and cultures of that country. So that's something we always, try to keep in mind and work directly with them to implement. So you can go to the next slide. And so the kind of next stage, I kind of described some of the direct emissions measurements and controls, but once they're emitted, once they're in the air, again, it's really important to have good, high quality measurement to understand what the existing air quality is and how we can, even though there are some methods that we can mitigate the air pollution itself even after it's emitted. So we can go on to slide 15. And on the measurement side of things, and again, it's important for us to really understand how effective are any control strategies that we've implemented. If control strategies haven't been implemented yet, it's important to just understand what the existing conditions are so we can assess effectiveness of these control strategies in the future. And again, understand if any adjustments are needed. So generally, there's multiple monitoring techniques when it comes though to understanding impacts on control strategies, like health policy. In most countries, including the United States, we base it off of fixed regulatory monitors. So these are analyzers that have been very highly tested, understanding their accuracy and precision well. We have, and again, other countries have strict quality assurance procedures that are followed, housing procedures that are followed. They're usually in temperature controlled shelters and things. So again, the data is of very high quality and well known, I think, worldwide. Many people are aware, like many of our U.S. embassies have PM monitors that are regulatory grade and are operated in this way. But there are other kinds of measurement techniques that can also be useful. Again, really growing in popularity over the last few years have been portable low-cost sensors. These can be even as little as $50 to $100 US. You can site them almost anywhere. Most are either battery operated or don't require power at all. They're passive. So they've really grown in popularity, but it's that understanding of what is their actually precision and accuracy, how useful is that data, and it's really important, especially countries that haven't had much history in air monitoring to really understand what the data from these low-cost sensors needs. And then we also do mobile monitoring, and that's really gained in popularity as well. And mobile can use the regulatory grade equipment, and I have an example of electric vehicle we have at the EPA is that middle picture, and that's got regulatory grade equipment, probably about $500,000 worth of equipment in it, where we can drive and do ambient air quality measurements and understand things like how concentrations change away from a road or a major transportation source. But also these low-cost sensors have been really popular, used in mobile ways, so people either walk or bike with the sensors, or they've been put in vehicles as well to try to understand spatial variability of air pollution levels. And again, all of these techniques have their strengths and their limitations, and it's important to understand and often to integrate these different measurements. So we can go to the next slide. And another area that we do a lot of capacity building is on the air quality modeling side. So again, when we're looking at transportation source impacts, we usually, we have to separate it up from we estimate what the emissions are first, and then we also simulate and estimate what the dispersion is in the atmosphere after they're emitted. So there are a number of models that are available for each of these. So in the US, we have what's called the MOVES model, and there is an international version called MOVES International. And generally, what often in other countries that use this, it's based off of U.S. and some European emission standards and typical emission rates. So often those are used initially to understand with local activity data. But then also, they are available. Country-specific emission factors can be integrated and implemented to create a model for a particular country. So an example of someone who's done that is China. China started using the national model about 2007, but then started to collect their own emissions data and slowly work their way up to developing their own impact model, as they call it. So then on the air dispersion side, again, we have an air model in the US, so that can estimate these local impacts from transportation and other sources. EPA also has what we call R-Line, which is like a research type of model that can integrate some other issues like, and I'll talk about it a bit, like solid structures or barriers near roads. In Europe, they have what's called the ADMS model, and these are both often popularly used in other countries. They're based off of just physical parameters, and so they aren't specific issues. So again, they've been successfully integrated into programs worldwide. It's going to in popularity is doing benefits assessment, different policies, whether using it to justify implementing a control strategy or an environmental policy, or to evaluate that policy. And we use for this, again, to that end, their Key Plus model up, which is very similar and conceptually pretty much the same. So again, these have been popular for countries to implement, to justify. So as far as that can be implemented. So again, especially.
Sorry, Richard. Are we still on slide 16? We're losing you a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, we switched to the next slide. 17.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, the connection is a little iffy right now.
Okay. Yeah. Again, just interrupt if you stop hearing me. Strategies that have and can be implemented in an area. So there's low and no emission zones. So essentially only allowing very low to no emitting vehicles within a certain area, or just not allowing vehicles at all within a certain area to again keep quality in that particular region or area. Another program that's grown and been implemented in Stockholm and London are congestion pricing. So you actually charge vehicles for driving in a certain area during a certain amount of times. So again, these are similar to activity reduction programs like transit and walking biking options, but a little bit different because again, they're really affecting air quality, especially at the local scale. If you have an area that's a very, what we call hotspot or very high concentrations, that this can be effective programs. There's also been proposed like what we call development exclusion zones. So an example of this is in California. They try to restrict schools from being sited too close to major highways. So it's essentially, not allowing either certain development or any near the pollution source themselves, other than to change or control the source itself. You distance people from those sources. And then the area that I'll talk a bit more about, because it's both grown in popularity and interest, is using built and green infrastructure. So this is especially for areas that might have existing concerns or problems. You know, are there certain features that urban planners or developers can put in place to actually reduce the amount of the emissions that actually get to, you know, communities and what people are breathing. So we can go to the next slide, slide 18. These structures, you know, we generally separate them as built or green infrastructure, so, you know, actually physical barriers or objects, or how we can roadside vegetation to again, improve local air quality. And these are things that can be implemented at a national level by governments, or it can even be implemented at the local community scale. So a community can do it, local government can do it. So it's one of the reasons that this has gained in interest, because it's a way that local communities can control their air quality if they feel that things aren't happening at the national level. So before I talk a bit about their air quality benefits, which have, you know, been shown, or how they can reduce and improve local air quality, it's always important to note one of the reasons that we looked into this area was because of some of the other benefits that these structures already have. So a common solid structure is a noise barrier, but I just want to point out that this could still just be like a fence or something, not quite as extensive as a noise barrier. But, you know, these physical solid barriers can reduce noise. Often they can improve aesthetics, separating people from these major highways. They can be a safety benefit as well for that reason. And then with roadside vegetation, there's a number of other benefits that vegetation can provide, from stormwater runoff, carbon sequestration, heat island effects, in improving or limiting the heat island effect. Again, aesthetics, and a lot of studies show property values increase when there's more vegetation, and then just general community livability. And really a number of studies is the one I show here in the slide, but there's a number of studies that show just being exposed to and near vegetation can improve public health in general. So you can go to the next slide. So as far as a resource, we developed some recommendations for organizations that are interested, especially interested in planting and maintaining roadside vegetation. The studies show that, again, roadside vegetation can improve local air quality, but some studies also can show that it can actually either not have any effect or even make air pollution worse locally. So we really try to show and highlight what are the key characteristics of the roadside vegetation that can both improve, but also characteristics to avoid, so you don't make pollution worse. And so these recommendations deal with vegetation alone, and they deal with vegetation along with solid structures like a fence or a noise barrier. And I did want to just point out, and I'll just show really quickly here in this presentation, that we developed these recommendations initially for some pilot studies that we did here in the U.S. in Detroit and Oakland. So you can go to the next slide. And again, I won't go into too much detail on this, but I did just want to highlight, you know, some of the examples that we include in the recommendation. So again, for roadside vegetation to be effective, just especially full coverage, you know, from the ground to the top of the canopy, no gaps, no openings, whether it be dead vegetation, highly porous vegetation, using vegetation that doesn't have seasonal effects like pine or other coniferous trees, and then mixing vegetation is also highly preferred as far as maintaining the vegetation, but then you know, the last and the effectiveness as well. And so again, these pictures just show a few examples from the report, anywhere from, again, like pine trees and mixing those trees, deciduous and pine, to just hedges, which could maybe be more useful for especially dense urban areas. So if we go to the next slide. Again, we also want to highlight examples of what not to do, especially one we like to point out is the top left, because a lot of times when we talk about, you know, trees or vegetation near a road, this is what people think, you know, the kind of nice ornamental trees. dotted right along continuously along the road, but again with the gap you can see underneath, that can actually allow that pollution from the roadway to get underneath and go through, but also the vegetation can actually slow wind speeds, so the air can stagnate underneath and right behind this kind of vegetation. So this is the kind of condition that could actually make downwind air quality even worse from the road. So again, we just try to highlight that, and there's a couple other examples in this slide. I guess the other thing to point out from this is the bottom right photo. Again, we also want to maintain the vegetation well, because even if you have a nice continuous buffer, full coverage, if you have an area of some dead trees or where the trees aren't growing in space, then pollution again can obviously travel right through there and again have no effect or make the situation worse. So you can go to the next slide. And again, we do discuss a bit about solid barriers alone. Again, really, so with the vegetation increases dispersion, but actually we do get some particular removal from vegetation. Now with these solid structures, they essentially just increase dispersion, dilution. So again, they're reducing what concentrations are downwind, but they're not actually removing any pollutants. But again, in an area where concentrations can be high, that could be really important for the health of nearby residents. So we try to review a bit of the benefits of the solid structures as well, but also considerations to avoid. Like the middle picture to the left, the concentrations obviously at the top of the barrier would be essentially the same or maybe just slightly less than if there was no barrier at all. So if you have populations where they can actually be exposed above the barrier wall or at the ends of the barrier, then again, their concentration exposures, wouldn't be affected by or improved by these solid structures. Then last, with the next slide, actually, a lot of research has shown that combining the solid with the vegetation can be the most effective, because with the solid barrier, you definitely avoid those gaps down low. You don't have to worry about, dead or highly porous vegetation. But then you have the vegetation either in front of or behind that actually also add the extra removal, especially of particulate matter. And so, whenever possible, combining the two can really be the most effective option. So we can go to the next slide, slide 24. And again, this is just to let you all aware of that there have been a number of review papers, especially around green infrastructure and green infrastructure benefits, that are available. There was actually a webinar series that was just recently conducted. That was an international series on this that included this topic as well. So for anybody who's interested, happy to share some of that. And then we can go to the next slide, slide 25. And again, just wanted to point out that we do have some pilot studies going on in the U.S., in Detroit and Oakland. These pictures are for the Detroit project, which is a park right near a major road with about 250,000 vehicles a day. Actually, many trucks. It's part of a big international trade door with Canada. And actually across a highway is a refinery that you can see some of the tanks in the distance on that top photo, or the photo to the left. So again, the plans are to plant vegetation barrier as shown in the profile drawn down there at the bottom. And we'll be doing air quality, meteorology, and noise measurements before and after planting that vegetation and assessing not just the air quality benefits, but there is some flooding issues at this site as well. So what the water runoff control benefits are to this plan too. So we can go to the next slide, and our other study is school in Oakland. So the picture there is the school itself. That was actually my title dot as well. So you can see it's right next to, again, a major highway, over 250,000 vehicles a day, over 20% of the trucks, because this is right near the Port of Oakland, so there's a lot of freight movement activity on this roadway. You see just an asphalt playground there for the kids, not very inviting. There's also actually often a lot of flooding on this. So the vegetation, again, you can see was just recently planted. And again, for air quality and for water runoff control. And so again, we did measurements before the planting and continued measurements after the planting to understand the effectiveness. So we can go to the next slide. And so again, lastly, we also are looking at how we can improve the air that people are directly breathing. So we're looking at exposures. So we can just go to the next slide. Again, so when we're looking at exposure reductions, we're really focusing on indoor air filtration, but we also do want to look at ways, again, to improve indoor air, whether it be through emission standards or some of the other concentration techniques like built-in green infrastructures I mentioned earlier. And then also we want to consider changing how we develop. So you can go to the next slide. Reducing exposures. And so I did just want to highlight that again, at EPA, we developed this guide to the right on what schools can do to mitigate their air pollution problems, especially what's focused on school roads, but this is also applicable if they're facing concerns from other air pollution sources. And this guide was essentially developed for like school districts and parents, and to give them essentially practical solutions that they can implement to mitigate air pollution and health concerns, obviously with asthma and other concerns by children. And this guide does address indoor and outdoor air quality. So again, just a few examples. So like for indoor air quality, we talk about ventilation options, using low pollution emitting products and materials inside the building itself, as well as visual air cleaners. If doing central air is possible, and the effectiveness of those air cleaners. And things like occupant behavior, when to open windows, when not to open windows, don't open windows, especially during rush hour, when vehicle traffic is high, when air pollution levels in general are high because of morning inversion conditions and things like that. So they're trying to educate on some of the timing as well of, when air pollution can typically be high in an urban area. So you can go to the next slide. And again, the guide also addresses outdoor air issues. So there's things on site, whether it be like for people, picking up, dropping off kids, where they're not idling, or at least reducing the amount of idling, upgrading on buses. And again, since this is a little bit U.S. focused, it was really talking about, upgrading of school buses, but also for other countries, this could still be applicable for transit, like transit either directly for schools or, transit that's passing by schools or the kids are often using to get to and from school. And then also that, does talk about walking and biking and really trying to encourage those options for active transport. Again, the guide also deals with the roadside structures like I talked about earlier. And it does also deal with like site location and design, which I'll talk about here in a minute. So we can just go to the slide. And this is actually some work that's ongoing right now that we're drafting some recommendations for, really trying to target developers and planners that, when they're looking, as I said earlier, the U.S., 1 in 5 new schools are located within 150 meters of a major highway. It's really trying to help understand how that can affect kids' exposures and how maybe redevelop land. So we just kind of give guidance. So this picture just goes like a high exposure where the school is right next to the road, but if you're actually developing as a community plan, instead you can move activities or buildings where people won't spend as much time, or especially the kids who are most susceptible won't spend as much time. So cleaning, parking, maintenance facilities to the road and the school as far away as possible. But then if there's retail, having retail where, again, most people won't spend a lot of time, have that being closer to the road rather than at the school, or some, residential, like in apartments or things like that, being close to the school. So with that, we can go to the next slide, the summary. And again, just trying to give an idea of some of the work that we're doing, some of the ways we're actually trying to help other countries implement effective control strategies, especially targeting at the transport sector. Again, based off these health concerns, it's really increased the importance for understanding and controlling these transport sector emissions, and especially because everyone is exposed to emissions every day. And so again, there's much evidence about the effects that exposures to these emissions cause. So again, from the EPA perspective, we really are trying to support especially capacity building and training for other countries to address this issue, and are looking at implementing both measurement and control programs, again, protect public health and welfare. So I do have my contact information. Happy to answer any questions after, but obviously happy to answer questions now too that the folks may have.
Thank you so much, Richard. We appreciate, really, we are very happy, and we thank you a lot for being with us and presenting this webinar. I just should say that we started talking with Richard some months ago, and we're very happy that we finally have this webinar. So guys, those of you who are in and connected and would like to make a question, could you please post your questions in the chat? And through that, I will try to moderate the next section. We have a few minutes before we have our ending. That doesn't mean that if you have some questions, please send them to either Richard or Ken, and we can share with all of you. The webinar will be also posted, right, Ken?
Yes, you could find the recorded version of this webinar on the Clean Air Learn page of the CityFix. So I can send everybody a link to that page once the webinar is posted.
Good. So we have a few questions. Two of them, Richard, are related to moves. So very specific to moves, to the moves model. One is what Euro standards are supported by moves, and the other one is how do you run it by in order to calculate emission maintenance program benefit emission factor inventory mode. And the other one is related to, they're very interested in a publication that you mentioned, because that's from Gabriela Canales in a plan. They are developing and planting a strategy for the metropolitan area of Guadalajara, and would like to see whether they could consider some of these criteria. So Richard,
okay, sure.
would you like to make a comment on the moves?
Yeah, sure. So with moves, and I would have to actually double check, because moves international, it's not.
I guess we lose you, Richard. Guys, could you please mute your mics, those of you who are connected? That will help also to reduce the, and I guess Richard just dropped, so we will wait until he connects again. And I just would like to mention that, yes, some of the publications that Richard has mentioned, we will be sure that they are listed as additional references. So let's see if he is able to connect again. So we have more questions, but Richard hasn't been able to be connected again. Oh,
Hello,
Okay.
this is
Yeah.
Rick.
Okay, Richard, go ahead.
uh, uh, yeah, I'll continue on. I don't think you probably heard most of the response.
No, we
So
didn't.
on the on Moves International, the last it had up to like Euro 5 standards included. I'm not sure if the Euro 6 standards have been updated in the Moves International or not. It's definitely got all the US up to what we call Tier 3 standards for light duty and our most recent 2010 heavy duty standards. But yeah, we'd have to double check because obviously this agency, there's more focus on.
Richard, we lost you again. So it seems like again we lost Richard. So we would like you ask all of you guys who have, if you have some questions, please post it in the chat, and we will try to get them some comments from Richard when even after the webinar. Would that be a solution, Ken? Oh yeah, we have Richard again.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep hoping that this will stick, but yeah, obviously we've been having some issues out here. So
Yeah.
let me go to the second question then, and maybe the easiest thing too is just to get out is like, you know, for people that are interested in any actually like of the papers or resources that I mentioned, it might be easiest if they email me, and then I'd be happy to share that information. And then if there are any specific, you know, questions and interest in implementing, you know, any of these programs, I could try to provide some additional either, you know, resources that we have, or just, you know, some of my, you know, thoughts and experiences of implementing these programs, whether it being in the US or in other countries.
Yeah, that would be great, Richard. We can actually, if we can include it in one part of the webinar, so everyone can see, and of course they can write to you or ask Ken, and then we can send you the questions. I will just, I mean, considering the time, Richard, and of course we can keep track of these questions. So there is a couple of questions related to. And I guess that's important that you mentioned that sometimes when you have these mitigation strategies, some of them could be actually worse. So one of the questions is for the pollution barrier on a highway, where does the pollution ultimately go? And the second question is, do you have actions related with traffic speed management for improving air quality?
Yeah, so I'll address that second one first. Yeah, there are some other opportunities for those interested. We can, you know, discuss, because essentially the curve for emissions is a U-shaped curve. So the lower the speed, so idling and really low speed stop and go operations can lead to high emissions, but then also very high speed operations can lead to high emissions. So we do share that information and work with urban areas, you know, trying to, you know, keep speeds at as ideal a rate as possible. And so some things too, you know, that I didn't really discuss, but things like traffic signalization, coordination, so that there's, you know, not people stopping and going from light to light along the major thoroughfare and things like that, are also some speed management options that we have, you know, addressed and talked about in the future, and that's something that could be talked about. But then also managing, again, the high speed or really high acceleration events for like an on-ramp to a highway and things like that as well. So yeah, we do try to address that. Then, yeah, as far as the, you know, pollution and buyers, you know, it's not something that we often get into from like a guidance perspective, because that can really vary, and that's why we really promote the use of these tools to evaluate that. You know, part of the combining the emission measurement and the emission especially modeling tools is to essentially do that, to identify where these hotspots or these very localized areas of high concentrations can occur. I guess, though, as far as a general rule, as I pointed out in the one slide that was like summarizing the air pollution measurements, like near roadways and how high they are, especially within that first 100 meters or so, and even out to 200 meters, 300 meters. We see very consistently near these large roadways that concentrations are highly elevated within that distance. So if it is possible to avoid that, but also, again, keeping in mind, like we say, sometimes though that can lead to other unintended consequences. So like if we decide not to place a school within that distance from a road, but it means that kids either have to spend extra time on a bus or in a car or in traffic just to get to a school that's further away from the road, well, that can actually mean that their exposure is worse. So we really do suggest, things like that we look at these tools, we look at these models to really understand what the concentrations are, what the potential exposures are, to make a best decision for, and sometimes, unfortunately, it's got to be a case-by-case basis, but that often is the most beneficial approach.
Thank you, Richard. And one more question. I mean, you really mentioned, it's not only to, you can reduce the emissions nearby the schools, so you can actually place the schools where there's no highway, but you have to consider how the kids are transported. Do you envision, with this idea of being more aware of the air that we are breathing, and particularly now that people are staying home and they are seeing some changes in terms of air pollution, do you see anything in the future that will be related to protect particularly these schools and children in the schools, that could bring some of all these measures, all of these ideas of how to reduce the exposure, like to be reconsidered when we go back to normal or kind of normal activities? How can we bring all this knowledge that you have, that you guys have actually gathered over all these years, to reduce the exposure, not only reduce the emissions, but reduce the exposures to those who are inside the schools or community level?
Yeah, that's why, I think it's important, sharing the information. So I think, education and outreach is such a large component to this issue. And it will be interesting, I think, to see, how people do react to the, generally it seems, pretty much across the world, air quality has improved in almost all locations, and in some places very dramatically. And, to see how the people really respond to that, and if they do put more demands on their government. And the example that I like to point to, so I started working in China with the Chinese government back in 2007 when they were looking at implementing a lot of these techniques for the Olympics. And, they were fairly successful. And then the population, saw how things could be. And they really went back after the Olympics. They went back to kind of the old ways and, the poor air quality again. And it really was a lot of the people in the population, because they saw the difference. They really liked that difference. They wanted that difference. And then also there was more information out there on what the adverse health effects were and other, concerns related to air pollution. And so, I really attribute a lot of the movement forward in China to, those conditions, those events, and, that activity. And so it will be interesting for me to see, if this situation worldwide kind of does the same in many of these other countries. It sounds like it's already some of that happening in India, and I'm doing some work down in Peru, and we hear a lot of that from folks in Peru as well. So, but yeah, then as far as bringing things together, you know, again, that's why we're trying to, you know, advertise and make aware as best possible, you know, some of the resources that we have, some of the lessons learned that we've had from working with other countries, in hopes that you know, a lot of this will be implemented there, and you know, a lot more interest and actions, you know, to address this issue.
Great. Thank you so much. And well, we will first like to thank Dr. Baldauf really for his time, and we hope to continue this collaboration, and hopefully soon we will have something more to share and to work with some of you guys who are connected. So I would just like to thank, on behalf of WRI Air Quality Group, we are continuing these Tech Talks every month, so please be aware. And so Ken will let us know when the webinar is uploaded. So I hand it up to Ken, and thank you so much to everyone who connected today, and of course to Richard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And again, sorry for the technical difficulties, I guess part of these times.
Yeah, this is part of what we are doing, don't worry.